The intake form asked for species classification, estimated mass, threat posture rating, and dietary toxin profile, and Meyerth Solin filled out every field with the meticulous care of a second-year veterinary xenobiology student who had never once received a grade below distinction. She sat at her assigned terminal in the observation wing of the Tail and Interspecies Medical Institute, her slender gray fingers moving across the haptic interface, and she entered the data the way her instructors had taught her, dispassionately, thoroughly, with clinical distance maintained at all times. The subject was an earth animal designated Canis lupus familiaris, variant Labrador Retriever. Coat color, pale gold, graying at the muzzle and around the eyes. Estimated age, 11 standard Earth years, which the briefing packet translated to late geriatric in the species' typical lifespan. Mass, 29 kilograms. Condition on intake, mild bilateral hip dysplasia, early-stage cataracts in the left eye, a healed fracture in the right foreleg that had set with a barely perceptible misalignment. Threat posture rating. The form offered a sliding scale from 0 to 12, with 12 being the maximum documented lethality for a bonded companion animal from a Class 14 world. Meyerth looked through the observation glass at the animal lying on the padded examination platform. It was asleep. Its chest rose and fell with the deep, slow rhythm of something that had decided the universe was an acceptable place to be unconscious in. One of its ears was folded back against its skull. Its paws twitched occasionally, chasing something only it could see. She entered a 3. Her supervisor, clinical lecturer Doran Vess, would have entered a 9. Vess entered a 9 for everything that came from Earth. Vess had published 11 papers on deathworld companion biology and maintained a personal threat index that started where the official one ended. Vess believed, with the unshakable conviction of a researcher who had spent 40 years studying a subject from behind reinforced glass, that every Earth animal was a loaded weapon held in the careless hand of a species too dangerous to understand what it was holding. Meyer thought the dog looked tired. She finished the intake form, submitted it to the Institute's central archive, and pulled up the observation protocol for the first module of her practicum rotation. Earth companion animals, living specimens, supervised contact pathway. The module had been added to the veterinary curriculum 6 standard years ago, after the Coalition's medical division determined that too many xenobiologists were graduating without ever having been in the same room as a deathworld animal. The fatality rate among first contact veterinary responders had been unacceptable, not because the animals attacked, the review board had noted with visible discomfort, but because the veterinarians panicked, and panicking near a deathworld animal produced outcomes that calm did not. The solution was exposure. Controlled, graduated, supervised exposure, beginning with geriatric specimens of the lowest aggression Earth breeds and progressing, over the course of 3 semesters, to working-age canines, felines, and, in the final module, equines. Meyerth was in week 1. The geriatric Labrador was her assigned subject. His name, according to the handler's file, was Wren. His handler was a human named Davy Cortez, who was listed in the Institute's records as a civilian veterinary consultant, attached under the Coalition's cross-species medical exchange program. Cortez was 43, stocky, dark-haired, quiet in a way that Meyerth had learned was specific to humans who worked with animals. He did not speak unless the information was necessary. He did not move quickly. He carried himself with the low-temperature composure that the niche literature called handler stillness, and Meyerth had observed, in the 4 days since Cortez and Wren had arrived at the Institute, that the stillness was not performed. It was structural. The man was calm the way foundation stone was calm. It was not a choice. It was load-bearing. Cortez was sitting on the floor of the examination room beside the sleeping dog, reading something on a handheld device. He was wearing a gray utility shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his boots were scuffed, and there was dog hair on his trousers, and he looked like someone who had stopped caring about appearances several careers ago. Ren's head was resting on Cortez's left boot. Cortez had not moved the boot in 47 minutes, which Meyerth knew because she had been timing it on her observation log. She opened the next section of her practicum workbook. Module 1, Objective 3, observe and document the resting behavior of the assigned specimen. Note indicators of stress, comfort, social bonding, and environmental assessment. Compare observed behavior to the baseline ethogram provided in Appendix C. Meyerth looked at the dog. The dog was asleep on a human's boot. She began to write. The first supervised contact session was scheduled for day 5. Meyerth arrived at the observation wing at 600, 40 minutes before the session, because early arrival was protocol and protocol was the architecture that held panic at a distance. She had reviewed the contact procedure 17 times. She had memorized the emergency withdrawal sequence. She had practiced the hand positions for non-threatening approach on the foam training model in the simulation lab until clinical lecturer Vess had told her, with the particular weariness of someone who had watched too many students over-prepare for the wrong things, that the foam model was not going to teach her anything the dog would recognize. The model doesn't breathe, Vess had said. The model doesn't smell you. The model doesn't decide. The dog will do all 3 in the first 4 seconds, and everything after that depends on what it decided. What if it decides I'm a threat? Then it will tell you, and you will listen, and if you listen correctly, nothing happens. That is the entire protocol, Solène. Listen to the animal. Meyerth did not find this reassuring. Cortez was already in the contact room when she arrived. The contact room was a ground-level space, 6 meters square, padded floor, ambient lighting calibrated to replicate Earth-standard daylight at late morning. The observation glass was one way. Vess would be watching from the other side with 2 medical technicians and a sedation kit that Meyerth hoped, with a fervor she would not have admitted to her cohort, would remain unopened. Ren was lying in the center of the room, his chin on his paws. He looked up when Meyerth entered through the airlock, his ears lifted. His tail moved once against the padded floor, a slow, heavy sweep that displaced air Meyerth could feel from 3 meters away. She stopped. Her hearts were running fast, both of them, the dual-pulse staccato that her species produced under perceived threat. Her scales had tightened along her forearms, the involuntary dermal response that was supposed to protect against impact. She was standing in a room with a deathworld predator whose species had been classified as apex for longer than her civilization had maintained written records, and it was looking at her with brown eyes that held absolutely no urgency. Cortez was sitting against the far wall, cross-legged, hands on his knees. He looked at Meyerth the way he looked at everything, steadily, without expectation. "Whenever you're ready," he said. Meyerth took 1 step. Ren's eyes tracked the movement. His tail swept again. His mouth opened slightly, and she could see his teeth, worn and yellowed with age, and the sight triggered a cascade of threat assessment data from her training that she had to consciously override because the data was screaming danger and the animal was wagging its tail. She took another step, then another. She was 2 meters from the dog. She could smell him now, a warm, complex scent that was unlike anything in the Institute's scent library, organic and layered, fur and skin, and something underneath that she would later learn was the baseline olfactory signature of a canine that had been living in close quarters with a human for over a decade. Their scents had merged. The dog smelled partly like Cortez. Cortez, she realized when she thought about it later, smelled partly like the dog. "Sit down," Cortez said, "on the floor slowly." Meyerth lowered herself to the padded surface. Her legs folded beneath her in the posture her species used for medical examinations, knees apart, weight on the shins. She was now at the dog's eye level. Ren looked at her. She looked at Ren. The dog stood up. Meyerth's dermal plates clamped. her hands pressed flat against the floor, every alarm in her biology fired. Wren walked toward her with the stiff, careful gait of an old animal whose hips no longer moved the way they once had. He stopped a half-meter from her knees. He sniffed her hand. His nose was cold and dry against her scales, and the contact lasted 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, Myrth felt something shift in the architecture of her understanding that she would spend the rest of the practicum trying to name. The dog sat down in front of her. He looked at her face. His tail moved once. Then he leaned forward and placed his chin on her knee. Myrth did not move. She could feel the weight of his head through her medical scrubs, the solid, patient pressure of a skull that belonged to a species engineered by 40 millennia of coevolution to communicate one message through physical contact. I am here. I have decided you are safe. We are at rest. Good, Cortez said from the wall. That's exactly right. Myrth did not know if he was talking to her or to the dog. She suspected it did not matter. She stayed on the floor for 73 minutes. Wren did not move his chin from her knee. When she finally stood, following the withdrawal protocol, her observation log was empty. She had not written a single note. She had, for 73 minutes, simply been in the presence of an animal that had decided she was an acceptable place to rest, and the experience had overwritten every clinical framework she had brought into the room. She filed her report that evening. Under Module 1, Objective 3, she wrote, "The specimen rested its head on my knee for 73 minutes. Stress indicators, none observed. Comfort indicators, sustained physical contact, slow respiration, closed eyes, tail movement on contact initiation. Social bonding, unclear. Environmental assessment by the specimen. The specimen assessed me in approximately 2 seconds and appeared to classify me as furniture." Clinical lecturer Vess read the report, circled the word furniture, and wrote in the margin, "Correct. Welcome to Earth Animal Studies." The weeks folded into each other the way clinical rotations always did, structured and measured, and occasionally interrupted by moments that refused to fit inside the structure. Week 2, Myrth learned to take Wren's vitals: blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, core temperature. The equipment was human standard, modified for alien hands, and the dog lay still for every measurement with the patience of an animal that had been poked and prodded by veterinarians for 11 years, and had long ago decided that the process was boring but permissible. Cortez showed her the correct placement for the stethoscope, adjusting her grip on the instrument with hands that were calloused and careful. She pressed the resonator against Wren's ribcage and heard, for the first time, the sound of an Earth canine heart. It was slower than she expected, steady, a low, rhythmic percussion that sounded less like a biological process and more like something geological, like the deep pulse of a planet that had been turning for 4 billion years and had no intention of stopping. "His resting rate is 52 beats per minute," Cortez said. "That's normal for his age and breed." "It sounds heavy," Myrth said. "It is heavy. That's a deathworld heart. It's built to run in atmosphere that would put you on a ventilator. It pumps blood that carries 4 times the oxygen density yours does, through a vascular system that was designed to survive falls, fights, infections, parasites, and the kind of atmospheric pressure that would crack your bones." Cortez paused. "It also sounds like that when he's dreaming about chasing squirrels." Myrth looked at Wren. Wren looked at the ceiling with the expression of a being who had heard this lecture before and had opinions about it that he was too dignified to share. "What is a squirrel?" she asked. "A small earth rodent. They live in trees. He's never caught one. He's been trying for 11 years. "Why does he keep trying?" Cortez smiled. It was the first time Myrth had seen him smile. It changed his face the way weather changes a landscape briefly and without warning. "Because he's a Labrador, trying is the point." Week 3 brought the behavioral observation module. Myrth was required to catalog Wren's daily routines: map his interaction patterns with Cortez, and document any behaviors that deviated from the baseline ethogram. She set up her recording equipment in the observation wing and settled in for what she expected to be hours of clinical documentation. What she documented was this. At 6:30, Cortez entered the living quarters assigned to the exchange program. Wren was waiting at the door. His tail began moving the moment Cortez's footsteps became audible in the corridor, 6 seconds before the door opened. When Cortez entered, Wren stood, pressed his nose against Cortez's hand, and then walked to the food station, where he stood looking at the bowl until Cortez filled it. Cortez filled it. Wren ate. Cortez poured himself something from a thermos that smelled, even through the observation system's chemical sensors, like it could strip industrial coating. At 700, Cortez attached a lead to Wren's collar and walked him through the Institute's ground-level transit corridor. Wren walked at heel, his shoulder aligned with Cortez's left knee, his pace matched precisely to the human stride. When Cortez stopped, Wren stopped. When Cortez moved, Wren moved. The synchronization was not trained obedience, Meyerth realized after watching it for the 5th consecutive morning. It was something older and more fluid than obedience. It was two organisms that had calibrated their rhythms to each other over the course of a decade, the way binary stars calibrate their orbits, not through command but through proximity and time. At 7:30, they reached the garden terrace that the Institute maintained for visiting species environmental enrichment. Cortez unclipped the lead. Wren walked to a patch of sunlight on the stone pavers and lay down in it with the deliberate, sighing satisfaction of an animal that had located the single best spot in the building and was going to defend it by the simple expedient of being too comfortable to move. Cortez sat on a bench nearby. He did not read. He did not check his device. He sat and watched the dog lying in the sun, and on his face was an expression that Meyerth's training had not equipped her to categorize. She tried. She cross-referenced it against the emotional expression databases for 17 species. She ran it through the Institute's affect recognition software. The software returned, inconclusive, human facial expression outside standard emotional taxonomy. Closest match, grief 22%, contentment 19%, recognition 17%, anticipatory loss 14%, love 12%, resignation 9%, unknown 7%. Meyerth stared at the readout. The software had returned 7 categories, none of them dominant. All of them present simultaneously on one human face, while the human watched a dog sleep in the sun. She added a note to her observation log. Human emotional expression regarding companion animal appears to operate in superposition. Multiple contradictory affective states coexist without resolution. This may be a deathworld adaptation. Vess read the note and wrote, "It is not an adaptation. It is the cost of loving something that dies before you are ready. Continue observations." Week 4 was the turning point, though Meyerth did not recognize it as one until later. The practicum required a supervised medical procedure, a routine joint assessment for Wren's hip dysplasia, including a physical manipulation of the affected joints to evaluate range of motion and pain response. The procedure was standard geriatric care. It would cause discomfort. That was the point of the module. The student needed to learn how to cause necessary discomfort to a deathworld animal without triggering a defensive response. Cortez prepared Wren in the examination room. The dog lay on his side on the padded table, his breathing steady, his eyes open and tracking Meyerth as she entered with the assessment kit. Cortez's hand was on Wren's shoulder, not restraining, resting. "He knows what this is," Cortez said. "He's had this assessment every 6 months for the last 3 years. He doesn't like it, but he'll hold still." "How do you know he'll hold still?" "Because I asked him to." Meyerth looked at the hand on the dog's shoulder. "You asked him." "I told him easy before you came in. That's his word for this is going to be uncomfortable, but I'm here and you're safe. We've been using it since he was a pup." Meyerth positioned herself at the table. She placed her hands on Wren's hip, feeling through the fur and muscle for the joint capsule beneath. The dog's breathing changed, quickening slightly as her fingers found the affected area. His head lifted from the table. His eyes found Cortez. "Easy," Cortez said. The dog's head lowered, his breathing slowed, his eyes stayed on Cortez's face. Myrth manipulated the joint. She felt the crepitus, the grinding of cartilage worn thin by 11 years of a body built for running and jumping and retrieving and living at full velocity on a planet where gravity pressed harder, and the air burned hotter, and the ground hit with more authority than anything on her homeworld. She felt the dog's muscles tense against the discomfort, and then she felt them release, not because the discomfort had stopped, but because the hand on his shoulder had not moved, and the voice had said easy, and the dog had made a decision, somewhere in the deep architecture of trust that his species had been building with humans for 400 centuries, that if the hand was there, and the voice was steady, then the discomfort was tolerable. She completed the assessment. She documented the range of motion, the pain indicators, the compensatory gait patterns. She noted the fluid accumulation in the left joint capsule and the early calcification along the femoral head. She wrote a clinical summary that was precise and thorough and contained no emotion whatsoever. Then she went to her quarters and sat on her bunk for 20 minutes with her hands flat on her knees and her heart running at resting pace and her mind entirely occupied by the image of a dog looking at a man's face, and deciding that pain was acceptable because the man was present. She did not cry. Her species did not produce tears. But the closest equivalent, a slow dilation of the secondary pupils that her people called the deep seeing, held for the full 20 minutes, and when it finally subsided, she understood something about Earth companion animals that no textbook had managed to convey. The animal did not trust the procedure. The animal trusted the person, and the trust was not a contract. It was not conditional. It was not exchanged for food or shelter or the cessation of discomfort. It was given, wholly and without reservation, to one individual, and it was given every day, and it would be given every day until the animal died, and the giving was the animal's entire contribution to the relationship, and it was enough. It was, in the assessment of a species that had survived a Class 14 world through cooperation and loyalty, and the biological imperative to bond, not just enough. It was everything. That evening, Myrth accessed the Institute's xenopsychology archive and searched for literature on interspecies trust formation. She found 947 papers. She filtered for Earth companion species. The number dropped to 31. She filtered for peer-reviewed empirical studies with direct observation of living specimens. The number dropped to 4. 4 papers. In the entire body of coalition xenobiological research, 4 papers described what Myrth had just felt under her hands. The moment a deathworld predator chose to remain still during a painful procedure, because a single human voice said a single word. She read all 4. They were competent. They were thorough. They were, without exception, incomplete. The papers documented behavior and cataloged neurochemistry. They measured cortisol curves and oxytocin spikes. They did not acknowledge what Myrth had felt in the room, that the dog was not responding to a stimulus but to a person. And the difference between those two things was the difference between understanding a language and understanding what it meant to be spoken to. She closed the archive and opened a blank document. She did not know what it would become. She knew only that the existing literature had a hole in it shaped like a dog's chin on a student's knee, and someone needed to fill it. Week 5 was when Myrth began to understand what Cortez already knew. Wren was slowing down. The hip dysplasia was progressive. The cataracts were thickening. His gait, which had been stiff but functional when he arrived at the Institute, had deteriorated to the point where the morning walks took twice as long and included 3 rest stops where Wren would sit on the transit corridor floor and look up at Cortez with an expression that was not pain and not complaint, but something closer to apology. "I am sorry I cannot go faster. I am trying." Cortez adjusted. He slowed his pace. He shortened the walks. He moved Ren's sleeping pad to a lower platform so the dog did not need to climb. He added a joint supplement to the morning food that smelled, according to the chemical sensors, like decomposing marine organisms, and Ren ate it without complaint because Cortez put it in the bowl and Cortez's hand was on the bowl, and therefore the contents were acceptable. One morning during week 5, Meyerth arrived at the observation wing early and found Cortez in the garden terrace, sitting on the stone pavers instead of the bench. Ren was lying beside him, and Cortez was holding the dog's right foreleg, the one with the old healed fracture, and massaging the joint with slow, careful pressure. The dog's eyes were half closed. His tail moved in time with the pressure, a slow metronome of contentment. Meyerth watched from the terrace entrance. She did not announce herself. The observation protocol permitted silent observation during routine handler-specimen interactions, and this was, technically, routine. Cortez spoke without looking up. He got this break jumping off a loading dock when he was 3, chased a bird off the edge. Didn't occur to him that the ground was 4 meters down. Labradors don't think about consequences. They think about the thing they're chasing. The consequences are someone else's department. Meyerth stepped closer. "Who set the fracture?" "I did. Field splint, then a proper cast at the nearest veterinary clinic, which was a 5-hour drive from the job site. He rode in my lap the whole way because the truck cab didn't have enough room for him to lie down. 5 hours, 30 kilograms of dog in my lap. Couldn't feel my legs by the time we got there." "That seems impractical." It was. He was scared and his leg hurt, and the only thing that made him stop whimpering was being close to me. So he was close to me. That's the math. His species runs on simple math. If the person is close, the world is acceptable. If the person is not close, the world is not. Every other variable is secondary. Meyerth looked at the dog's leg under Cortez's hands. The fracture had healed imperfectly. The misalignment was subtle but present, a slight deviation in the bone that would have been invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. Cortez's fingers found it without looking, the way a person finds a familiar path in the dark. "You have been massaging that leg for 8 years, Meyerth said. "Every morning. The scar tissue tightens overnight. If I don't loosen it, his first few steps are painful, so I loosen it." "Every morning. Every morning." Meyerth filed this under the growing category of observations that her clinical framework could not contain. A man who had massaged a dog's leg every morning for 8 years because the dog's first steps of the day would hurt otherwise. Not because anyone asked him to. Not because it was prescribed. Because the dog would hurt, and the man could prevent it, and the decision to prevent it had been made once and then repeated 3,000 times without reconsideration. Meyerth watched all of this through the observation glass. She documented it. She cataloged the progressive decline, the compensatory modifications, the handler's behavioral adaptations. She wrote clinical summaries and filed them with vets and received feedback that was, for the first time, not corrections but confirmations. "Good, you are seeing it now." Seeing what? She wanted to ask, but she did not ask, because she was beginning to suspect that Vess had been waiting for her to arrive at the answer on her own, and the answer was not a fact to be transmitted but a recognition to be earned. And earning it required watching a man slow down his entire life to match the pace of a dog that was running out of the time it had been allocated by a biology that burned hot and fast and brief. Week 6 brought the cohort. 7 other veterinary students from 4 species rotated through the Earth Companion Animal Module, each assigned their own specimen, each at a different stage of the graduated exposure protocol. Meyerth, as the student with the most contact hours logged, was designated as peer mentor, which meant she sat in the observation wing while her cohort entered the contact rooms for the first time and experienced, one by one, the same cascade of biological alarm and clinical confusion that she had experienced on day 5. Torin Kai, a Nathai student whose species had evolved as prey on a low-gravity world, froze in the contact room doorway when his assigned cat, a 14-year-old tabby named Sable, stretched and yawned, displaying teeth that were, by Nathai standards, the armament of a mid-tier predator. "It's yawning," Meyerth said through the communication link. "That's a comfort behavior." "It has teeth," Torin said, his voice flat with the particular stillness that prey species used when they were calculating escape vectors. "Every animal from Earth has teeth. Some of them have more than you'd expect. The teeth are not the relevant data point." "What is the relevant data point?" "The cat is lying on its back. In feline body language, that's an expression of trust. It is showing you its vulnerable underside because it has assessed you and determined that you are not a threat." "I am not a threat. I weigh 40 kilograms and I am made largely of cartilage." "The cat knows that. That's why it's comfortable." Torin entered the room. Sable rolled onto her side, tucked her paws against her chest, and went to sleep. Torin stood 4 meters away and watched her breathe for 90 minutes, and when he emerged from the contact room, his chromatophores were cycling through shades of blue-violet that his species associated with profound cognitive reorganization. "Solène," he said, "how does one file an observation report when one's observations do not correspond to any recognized analytical framework?" "You describe what you saw. The framework comes later. I saw a predator choose to be unconscious in my presence. My entire evolutionary history tells me that is impossible." "Your entire evolutionary history did not account for Earth." Torin considered this. "No," he said, "it did not." Meyerth watched her cohort move through the stages she had already passed. She watched Lisi Gren, a Torvathi surgical resident, recoil from a sleeping beagle whose snoring registered on the Institute's seismic monitors. She watched Pelor Vanth, a crystalline-shelled Drothai, spend an entire session analyzing the mathematical patterns in a parrot's vocalizations, and emerge declaring that the bird was either a genius or a random number generator, and that further study was required. She watched each of them arrive, one by one, at the same recognition she had reached on the floor of the contact room with a dog's chin on her knee. The animals were not what the textbooks said they were. They were something the textbooks had no vocabulary for. They were predators that had chosen to be companions. They were apex organisms that had voluntarily subordinated their lethality to a bond with another species, not because they had been broken or tamed or conditioned, but because the bond itself was more valuable to them than the full exercise of their capabilities. The word for that in the Talon medical lexicon did not exist. The closest approximation was a term from diplomatic jurisprudence that translated roughly as voluntary surrender of sovereign capacity in exchange for mutual covenant. It was a term designed for treaties between civilizations. Meyerth was watching it enacted between a man and a dog on a padded floor under artificial sunlight, and the scale of what she was witnessing grew larger every day. The cohort's second week produced the incident that would become a case study in 3 subsequent editions of the Practicum Handbook. Lisi Gren, the Torvathi surgical resident, had progressed to supervised contact with her assigned beagle, a 10-year-old male named Buckley whose primary behavioral characteristics were an absolute commitment to unconsciousness and a snoring pattern that the Institute's acoustic monitoring system consistently flagged as a structural integrity alert. Gren's species was large, scaled, and accustomed to establishing dominance through physical presence. She entered the contact room with the rigid posture and deliberate stride of a Torvathi, who intended to project authority over every organism in the vicinity. Buckley woke up, looked at her, and rolled onto his back. Gren stopped. She looked at Meyerth through the observation glass with an expression that communicated, in Torvathi, something between bewilderment and professional offense. "What is it doing?" she asked through the calm. "Submitting," Myrth said. "I haven't done anything." "You don't need to. You walked in tall and loud and smelling like a predator, and the dog's first instinct is to de-escalate. That's not fear. That's social engineering. He's telling you he's not competing with you. He's removing the possibility of confrontation before it begins. That is not a survival strategy. That is the opposite of a survival strategy. On your planet, yes. On Earth, it's the strategy that kept his species alive long enough to bond with the apex predator on the planet, which is the human. The dog's ancestors survived by being the thing that made the stronger species want to keep them around. Not through strength, through utility, through the willingness to defer. Gren looked at the beagle. The beagle looked at the ceiling, belly exposed, tongue lolling from one side of his mouth. He appeared to be enjoying himself. "The first predator in the history of my species to expose its belly to a stranger," Gren said slowly, "was already dead." "His isn't." Gren sat down on the padded floor, which was the first time in her life she had voluntarily lowered herself below the sightline of another predator. She sat and she looked at the dog, and the dog rolled onto his side and sighed. And within 20 minutes, his nose was resting against her scaled knee, and her hand was on his ribcage, and she was counting his heartbeats with the focused attention of a surgeon who had just discovered an organ she did not know existed. She would later describe it in her practicum report as the most disorienting clinical experience of her career, and she had performed emergency surgery on a Venathian fluid heart. Week 7 was the week the Institute held its biannual research symposium, and Cortez was invited to present. Myrth did not know what to expect. Cortez spoke in person the way he did everything else, slowly, without decoration, with the minimum number of words required to transmit information. She had seen him address vets, address the medical technicians, address the intake officer. Every interaction was the same, functional, warm without being warm, the way a well-insulated room was warm. You noticed it only when you stepped outside and realized how cold everything else was. The symposium hall seated 300. It was filled. Not because Cortez was famous, Myrth learned later, but because the Institute had circulated a notice that the Earth veterinary consultant would be presenting with his living specimen. And in the 6 years since the practicum module had been added to the curriculum, no human handler had ever agreed to bring a companion animal into an auditorium full of alien researchers. Cortez walked onto the stage with Wren at heel. The auditorium went silent with the particular quality of silence that a room full of scientists produced when they were all simultaneously recalculating their assumptions. 300 pairs of alien eyes focused on the animal walking beside the human, and the animal was walking slowly, and its muzzle was gray, and its gait was stiff, and it looked like what it was: an old dog at the end of a long life, following the person it had followed for a decade, because that was what it did, because following was not obedience but orientation, the way a compass follows north. Cortez stopped at the podium. Wren sat beside him. Cortez looked at the audience, and Myrth, sitting in the 3rd row, saw his face do something she had never seen it do before. He was nervous. Not visibly, not in any way that the effect recognition software would have registered, but she had spent weeks watching this man, and she knew the difference between his resting composure and the composure he built over uncertainty, and this was the second kind. He spoke without slides, without notes, without the holographic data visualizations that every other presenter had deployed. He stood at the podium with one hand on the edge and the other resting on Wren's head, and he talked about dogs. He talked about how the partnership began, not the sanitized version from the textbooks, the real one. Wolves that were hungry and humans that were hungry, and a mutual decision arrived at across generations that sharing a fire was better than fighting over scraps. The first wolf that slept beside a human campfire and woke up alive, and how that single act of trust, repeated across 10,000 years, had produced an animal whose neurochemistry responded to a human voice the way it responded to its own mother's scent. He talked about Wren. He talked about finding him at a shelter when the dog was 2 years old, surrendered by someone who had moved and could not take him, and how the dog had sat in the kennel and looked at Cortez through the wire and done nothing. Not barked, not whined, not performed, just looked. And Cortez had looked back, and the dog had made a decision, and the decision had held for 9 years. He talked about what the dog had seen him through. He did not enumerate. He said 9 years covers a lot of ground, and left it there. And the room understood, because every species in the room had a concept for the kind of ground a decade could cover. Then he said something that Myrth would remember for the rest of her career. "You study these animals because you're afraid of them," Cortez said. "And you should be. They are from a class 14 world, and they are predators, and their bite pressure can fracture bone, and their ancestors hunted in packs that could bring down prey 10 times their size. All of that is true, but it is not the important truth. The important truth is that they chose us. Out of everything on a planet that is trying to kill everything else on it, they chose the one species that would feed them and shelter them and grieve for them, and they gave us everything they had in return. Their loyalty, their attention, their time, and their time is short. That is the part you need to understand. Their time is short, and they know it isn't because they don't have the cognitive architecture to understand mortality, and so they give every day they have as if it will last forever. And the weight of that gift is something you will not understand until you have held one while it dies, and you realize that the animal gave you every single day it had, and it never once held one back." The auditorium was quiet. 300 researchers from 47 species sat in their seats and said nothing, and the silence was not the silence of boredom or confusion, but the silence of recognition, the silence that occurred when a fact too large for language entered a room and everyone felt it arrive. Wren yawned. His jaws opened wide, showing every worn tooth, and the yawn ended with a small sound that was half groan and half sigh, and the sound carried through the auditorium's microphone system and filled the hall with the particular vocalization of a Labrador Retriever who was too old and too comfortable to care about the 300 aliens staring at him. Someone in the back of the auditorium laughed, then someone else. Then the laughter spread, not mocking laughter but the involuntary laughter of release, the kind that occurred when tension broke, and what replaced it was not more tension but warmth. Cortez scratched behind Wren's ear. Wren leaned into his hand. The room watched. Myrth's secondary pupils dilated into deep seeing. She did not try to stop them. Week 8 was when Wren stopped eating. Cortez noticed before the automated monitoring systems did, because Cortez noticed everything about the dog before any instrument could register it. He was in the examination room within minutes of the first refused meal, his hand on Wren's ribcage, his face close to the dog's face, speaking in a voice so low that the observation microphones barely captured it. "Hey, buddy. What's going on?" Wren's tail moved once, a slow, heavy sweep. His eyes were open but clouded, the cataracts having progressed faster than the treatment protocol had projected. His breathing was even. His nose pressed against Cortez's palm and stayed there. Myrth ran the diagnostics from the observation wing. Blood work, urinalysis, cardiac rhythm strip, hepatic function panel. She compiled the results and cross-referenced them against the geriatric canine database, and the picture that assembled itself on her screen was one she had studied in the classroom but had never seen in a living animal. Systemic organ decline, progressive, multifocal. The kidneys were operating at 31%. The liver enzymes were elevated beyond the compensatory range. The cardiac rhythm showed intermittent arrhythmia that would become constant within weeks. She called Vess. Vess looked at the data, looked through the observation glass at Cortez sitting on the floor with the dog's head in his lap and said, "How long?" "The models estimate 4 to 6 weeks, with palliative support." "And without?" "Days, perhaps a week." Vess was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Does Cortez know?" "He knew before I ran the labs. He's been adjusting Ren's care for the last 3 days. Softer food, lower platform, more rest stops. He changed the walking route to avoid the corridor with the textured flooring because it aggravates the hip." Vess looked at her. "You observed all of that?" "He did not tell me. I observed it." "Good." Vess paused. "Solène, this is the part of the curriculum that the module was designed around. Not the contact protocol, not the vitals. This. What happens next is the reason we brought a geriatric specimen." Meyerth understood. She wished she did not, but she did. The palliative phase lasted 11 days. Meyerth documented every one of them with the thoroughness of a student who understood that she was witnessing something that her species had no framework for, and that the documentation was therefore not just academic but necessary. A record for the students who would come after her, evidence that what she was seeing was real. Day 1, Ren ate a quarter of his normal portion. Cortez supplemented with a high-calorie paste administered by hand, which meant Cortez sat on the floor of the examination room and fed the dog from his fingers, and the dog ate because the food came from that hand and no other. Day 2, Ren's morning walk was reduced to the length of the transit corridor, 52 meters. He stopped twice. Cortez waited each time, standing still in the corridor with the patience of a species that had learned, over millennia, that patience was not passive but was instead the most active form of care available to an organism that could not fix what was breaking. Day 3, Meyerth entered the contact room for her scheduled observation session and found Cortez lying on the padded floor beside Ren, both of them in the patch of artificial sunlight, Ren's head on Cortez's chest. The dog's breathing was audible from the doorway, slower than it had been, each breath drawn with a deliberation that suggested the autonomic process was becoming voluntary. She sat down on the floor 3 meters away and opened her observation log and wrote nothing. She sat and listened to the dog breathe and watched the man's hand move slowly along the dog's spine, and the room was quiet, and the sunlight was warm, and the two of them lay in it like they had been doing this for years, which they had, which was the point, which was everything. Day 4, Torin Kai, the Nathe student, came to the observation wing unscheduled. He stood beside Meyerth at the glass and watched Cortez on the floor with Ren. His chromatophores cycled through a sequence that Meyerth had learned to read as distress modulated by incomprehension. "Why does he stay?" Torin asked. "Because he said he would. He made no verbal commitment that I am aware of." "Not verbal, the commitment is structural. It was made the day he took the animal home and has been renewed every day since. Every meal, every walk, every morning massage of the foreleg. Each one is a renewal of the same statement, I am here. I am not leaving. You can depend on this." And the animal understands this. The animal has never considered the alternative. That is what makes it work. The dog does not evaluate whether Cortez will stay. The dog does not assess the probability of abandonment. The dog has simply incorporated Cortez's presence into its model of reality, the way you incorporate gravity. Gravity does not require trust. It simply is. Cortez, to that dog, simply is. Torin's chromatophores settled into a deep indigo that Meyerth had not seen before. "That is the most terrifying thing I have learned in this program," he said. "Why?" "Because it means the animal has given something it cannot take back, and the human knows this. And the human stays anyway, knowing that the weight of that gift will only increase as the animal declines, and that the final cost of accepting it will be the grief of losing the giver." Meyerth looked at Torin. Torin looked at the glass. Behind the glass, Cortez's hand moved slowly along Ren's spine, and the dog's breathing was steady, and the room was quiet, and the gift was being given, moment by moment, in the way it had always been given, without calculation, without reservation, without the possibility of return. Day 5. Ren could no longer stand without assistance. Cortez fashioned a sling from a section of padded medical webbing and supported the dog's hindquarters while he walked, bearing the weight with his arms and his back and his legs, carrying what the dog could no longer carry for himself. The morning walk was 8 meters. It took 12 minutes. When it was done, Cortez lowered Ren onto the sleeping pad and sat beside him and did not move for 3 hours. Day 6. Lisi Gren, the Torvathi surgical resident, submitted an unsolicited addendum to her practicum report. It read, "I have observed through the course of this module that the Earth companion animal bond operates on a principle that my species does not possess a word for. The closest term in my language translates to holding weight that is not yours. Among Torvathi, this is considered a deficiency of judgment. I am no longer certain that assessment is correct. I am requesting extended observation privileges for the terminal phase of specimen Ren, on the grounds that what I am witnessing constitutes primary data for which no substitute exists in the literature." Vess approved the request. By day 7, 4 members of Meyerth's cohort had made similar requests. The observation wing, designed for 1 student at a time, held 5. Meyerth documented the sling. She documented the 8 meters. She documented the 12 minutes and the 3 hours. She did not document what was on Cortez's face because the affect recognition software still returned inconclusive, and she had stopped trusting the software, and she had started trusting her own secondary pupils, which had been in deep seeing for 5 days. Day 7, Vess came to the observation wing. She stood beside Meyerth at the glass and watched Cortez hand-feed Ren the high-calorie paste. Each portion offered from the fingertips. Each portion accepted with the slow, deliberate mouth of an animal that was eating not because it was hungry, but because the hand was offering, and refusing the hand was not something within the animal's capability. "Solène," Vess said, "what are you seeing?" "I am seeing an animal that is dying, and a human who knows it, and neither of them is leaving." "Why not?" Meyerth considered the question. She had considered it for 7 days. The clinical answer was bond maintenance through the terminal phase, a behavior documented in Earth companion species and their human handlers, attributed to elevated oxytocin levels and pair-bonded attachment patterns. The clinical answer was accurate. The clinical answer was also, she understood now, completely and utterly insufficient. "Because leaving is not in the vocabulary," Meyerth said. "The bond does not have a termination clause. It does not expire. It does not recognize the end of utility or the onset of suffering as grounds for withdrawal. The human will stay because the animal trusts him to stay, and the animal trusts him because he has never left. And the cost of that, the cost of being the one who remains, is something the human has agreed to pay because the alternative is to be the one who doesn't remain. And that, for this species, is worse than grief." Vess was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That is not a clinical observation, Solène." "No," Meyerth said. "It is not. Put it in the report anyway. The curriculum needs it." Day 9. Ren stopped eating entirely. Cortez did not try to feed him. He sat on the floor beside the sleeping pad with his hand on the dog's ribcage, feeling the heart that had beat 52 times per minute for 11 years, and he spoke to the dog in a voice that Meyerth could not hear through the glass but could read on the man's lips. "Good boy, you did so good, buddy. You're the best dog. You're the best dog I ever had. Easy, easy now." The words were the same ones he had used on day 1 and week 1 and every day in between. Easy, good boy. The vocabulary of reassurance that the species had developed over 40,000 years, refined to its essential components, deployed now not to command or redirect or modify behavior but simply to say, "I am here. You are not alone. You will not be alone. Day 11. Wren died at 3:47 station time. Myrth was in the observation wing. She had not gone back to her quarters for 31 hours. She had been watching through the glass, her observation log open, her secondary pupils in deep seeing, documenting a process that did not need documentation and could not be captured by it, but demanded the attempt anyway. The dog's breathing changed at 3:40, the rhythm becoming irregular, the intervals between breaths lengthening. Cortez, who had been dozing with his back against the wall and his hand on Wren's side, woke instantly. He shifted carefully and placed the dog's head in his lap, and he put both hands on Wren's fur, one on the ribcage and one behind the ears, and he held them there. Myrth watched through the glass. She watched the breaths come slower. She watched Cortez's hand stay steady. She watched the last breath leave the dog's chest and not return, and she watched Cortez's hands continue their motion on the fur for 30 seconds after the breathing had stopped, because the hands did not know how to stop, and the man was not ready to tell them. Then Cortez leaned forward and pressed his forehead against the dog's head and stayed there, and Myrth turned off the observation equipment and sat in the dark, and let the deep seeing hold for as long as it needed to. She filed her final practicum report 3 days later. It was 412 pages. It contained clinical data, behavioral observations, physiological measurements, dietary logs, gait analyses, and a comprehensive geriatric care protocol for Earth Canis lupus familiaris that the Institute's review board would later adopt as the standard reference text for the xeno-veterinary curriculum. On the last page, under the heading Conclusions, she wrote, "The Earth companion animal designated Wren, Labrador Retriever, demonstrated throughout the observation period a behavioral pattern that does not conform to any existing model of predator-handler dynamics in the xenobiological literature. The pattern is characterized by unconditional physical proximity maintenance, sustained trust investment without reciprocal guarantee, and voluntary pain tolerance mediated by the presence of a single bonded individual. This pattern persists through terminal decline and does not attenuate with loss of function, suggesting that the bond is not utility-based but constitutive, an irreducible component of the animal's identity rather than a strategy for survival. The human handler, Cortez, D., demonstrated a complementary behavioral pattern characterized by progressive self-modification to match the declining capabilities of the companion animal, sustained caloric and medical investment beyond rational cost-benefit thresholds, and physical presence maintenance through the terminal phase without observed self-preservation withdrawal. The observed dyad suggests that the human-canine bond, as expressed in geriatric companion animals, is not a domestication artifact, but a co-evolved mutualism of such depth that it has become indistinguishable from the organism's individual survival drives. The animal does not serve the human. The human does not own the animal. They are, in a functional and observable sense, a single unit operating across two bodies, and the failure of one body does not terminate the bond, but transforms it into a form that the surviving member carries forward. I recommend that the term companion animal be retired from the xeno-veterinary lexicon. It implies a hierarchy that the observed data does not support. The human word, which I have verified through the cultural linguistics database, is closer to the phenomenon, partner. I further recommend that future cohorts be informed, prior to beginning the contact pathway, that the practicum will not teach them how to treat Earth animals. It will teach them what Earth animals are. These are different objectives, and only the second one matters." Clinical lecturer Vess read the report. She submitted it to the Institute's curricular review board without edits. She flagged the conclusions section for inclusion in the introductory briefing for all incoming veterinary xenobiology students. In the margin of the last page, in her small, precise handwriting, she wrote a single word: yes. Meyerth graduated at the end of the term. She was offered a research position at the institute, which she declined. She was offered a clinical placement at a coalition border hospital, which she also declined. She applied instead to the coalition's cross-species veterinary exchange program, the same program that had brought Cortez and Wren to the institute, and she requested assignment to an Earth-adjacent posting where she would work with human handlers and their companion animals in field conditions. The assignment board asked her why. She said because the textbooks are wrong and someone needs to rewrite them, and the only way to rewrite them is to be in the room. She did not say, because a dog put its chin on my knee and I felt the weight of 40,000 years of trust, and I cannot go back to studying it through glass. She did not say, because a man carried his dying dog 8 meters down a corridor, and it took 12 minutes and neither of them complained, and I want to understand a species that considers that a reasonable use of time. She did not say, because Davy Cortez, 3 days after Wren died, walked into the Institute's intake office and asked about the adoption process for a 9-year-old Labrador Retriever mix with a torn ear and a limp in the left foreleg that had been surrendered by a freight crew who didn't want the trouble. And when Meyerth asked him how he could do this again, how he could open himself to the same loss he had just endured, he looked at her with the same steady, low-temperature composure he had worn every day of the practicum and said, because she needs someone. And I'm someone. She did not say any of this. She did not need to. The assignment board read her practicum report, and the 412 pages said it for her, and she was approved, and she left the institute on a transport that carried her toward Earth's sector of the coalition, toward the work that would define her career, toward the rooms where the animals breathed and the humans stayed and the bond held, every day, every hour, until it could not hold any longer, and then the humans picked up what remained and carried it forward and started again. Because that was what they did, because that was what they were, because somewhere in the bright, hot, heavy gravity chaos of a Class 14 world, 2 species had looked at each other across a fire and made a decision, and the decision had held for 40,000 years, and it was holding still. In examination rooms and transit corridors and patches of artificial sunlight, in the weight of a head on a knee and the sound of a voice saying easy, in the grief that followed and the love that preceded it and the ordinary, devastating, unbreakable thing that lived between them. Meyerth had 1 note left in her observation log, unsubmitted, written on day 11 at 3:48 station time, 1 minute after Wren's last breath. It read, I understand now why they keep them. It is not because the animals are useful. It is not because they are beautiful or entertaining or functional. It is because the animals believe in them, completely, without reservation, without condition, without end. And being believed in like that by something that will die believing in you is the most expensive gift in the galaxy, and the humans pay for it every time, and they never stop paying, and they never stop accepting the next one. That is not a clinical observation. I do not care. She closed the log. She shouldered her kit. She walked toward the transport bay, where the ship was waiting, and the stars beyond the viewport were cold and vast and indifferent, and somewhere among them, on a planet that gravity had tried to crush and evolution had tried to kill, and the universe had tried everything it had and failed, a man was kneeling on a kennel floor with his hand on a dog's torn ear, saying easy, saying good girl, saying all the small, ancient words that meant I am here, I am staying, we begin again. And the dog was leaning into his hand, and neither of them was thinking about the cost, because the cost was already agreed upon, and it was worth it, and it had always been worth it, and it would be worth it for as long as either of them had breath to give. The transport engines hummed. Meyerth settled into her seat. She opened a new observation log, blank and waiting. She wrote day 1.